Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. Good. Tom, how are you?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing me on.
Yeah, I think when we exchanged emails and kind of got to in connection stuff, I was fascinated by the things you were talking about related to, ethics and morals and values. We had a really good phone conversation about how these ideas relate to this craziness we're living through in gymnastics right now. And so I'm excited to have you on and talk about maybe your expertise in the bioethics world, but then also kind of zoom out a little bit and say, like, what does this mean for coaches every day in the trenches, so to speak?
And I'm excited to share a lot of these ideas. In my own time and what I've seen with the sport, I've noticed that a lot of people will talk about ethics, they'll talk about morals, but very few people feel the need to dive deep into the literature or look at the canon of it. So you have a really rich field that spans thousands of years with really fresh ideas that come across as new to a lot of people. Well, they're 1,000-year-old ideas.
Yeah.
And when you apply them to gymnastics, it's like, wow, I hadn't thought of it that way. And it's like, if you dive into the literature and you read what's out there, you can bring a completely different perspective to the sport.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that's interesting too is, we are not the first culture or sport or group of people to face some moral and ethical dilemmas about like, oh, wait a minute, what we've been doing maybe is not ideal and we need to reevaluate ourselves. We need to kind of redefine what our own morals and standards are. And I've talked extensively on the podcast before about the need for coaches and parents and medical providers and even athletes to really define where their moral compass lies and what their ethics are and what they stand for. And I think that helps to make some hard decisions a little bit easier in the long run, but we're not the first people to face a cultural or identity crisis at all.
Yeah, this is completely true. Personally, I actually find ethics to be one of the most challenging branches of philosophy to operate within. Because when you talk to people, everybody kind of brings their own perspective. And it's not that to say that anybody's wrong. It's mostly to say that it's like we all kind of feel like we know. And so when you start studying ethics, it's a very personal thing. And it's very challenging to take your own ideas and say, well, maybe I'm wrong about these things. And when you really start doing it, it's a very uncomfortable branch of philosophy to operate within, because it really drags out some of the ideas that you hold very personal to yourself, and they're a part of your identity, and you start to see how maybe they're flawed. So for me, I've learned the most from ethics in the sense that you learn to be okay losing some of the ideas that you held very closely, because you can see where it develops a need to grow as a person. And as a coach, my own interactions with a lot of the people in the sport is we like to cling very closely to the ideas that we have. And we like to think that the sport can't really change because this is the way it's been, or we're progressing, or we're getting better at something. And so when you start challenging ideas that held very, very closely to people, it becomes a very personal thing, which for me, I think makes ethics as a branch of philosophy challenging, because you're trying to remove the subjective side of it and look at it from an objective perspective to at least get a better understanding without using yourself as a model. But it's almost always impossible to do this because it feels like it's really just what you're thinking in the moment.
Sure.
So.
Sure. Yeah. And I couldn't agree more. That resonates with me deep. Whereas, in my experience as a younger coach, I definitely felt that idea of like, my beliefs about how I coached and what I thought of myself, my perceptions of my approach to certain techniques or drills or philosophies was very much like woven into the very fabric of who I was as a person. And when somebody called those out or questioned those, I felt as though it was a personal attack on me, even though it wasn't. It was more an attack on the concept of the ideas. And I really see that a lot in a lot of the people I consult with, or what we're going through, especially in the last 3 years since a lot of these scandals have come out, is many people are not maybe open to some of these new ideas because they literally cling their sense of identity to them being a great coach, and their great coaching rests on the morals of, well, these are the way I do my drills and my flexibility and my conditioning. And I know these things and I don't involve other providers. And I think that is what is such a struggle for people to kind of to have that uncomfortable moral or ethical turmoil inside about, oh, wait a minute, maybe the way that I've approached this for 25 years is not in current line with the evidence on this topic or this idea. Maybe there are people who know more than me about certain topics, or I need to update my ideas. And that really kind of unravels the Pandora's lid on your box of like what you think is your identity.
I think you hit a couple really important points. One is that it is a matter of identity, and coaching is a matter of identity. And when you start questioning the ethics behind it, you start really diving into your identity and who you are as a person. And that's just a challenging thing to do in life. I think the other point that you hit on that we could articulate and go even further with is that it kind of works both ways. Whereas this is my identity as a coach and I derive it from my morals, but then you don't realize how much your morals are actually driven from being a coach. Right. So it's like I might feel like I'm doing something from an ethical perspective, but I'm actually creating an ethical perspective that allows me to do what I wanted to do as a coach. And we can get into that a little bit later. I think that's one of the ideas that I'd like to discuss, but that's going to get heavy really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start with maybe just a framework here of, bioethics, which I'm vaguely familiar with, but you've educated me on. And I think I'd like to share the very brief overview of some of the academic terminology and maybe zoom out and say, what does that mean for the everyday coach? So let's just start there and frame the conversation.
Well, bioethics as a field is a relatively young academic discipline. It's growing more and more relevant with the changing of the medical landscape. It's kind of a catch-all term for ethics that relates to the life sciences. Traditionally, you would have medical ethics, environmental ethics, and then animal ethics kind of fall within the bioethics sphere. Because, of course, bio means life, and then ethics is the study of morality. So it'd be morality that it involves life. More recently, bioethicists tend to write in the medical sphere. And when you see a lot of the literature coming out of bioethics, it's mostly medicine related. There are plenty of bioethicists who are writing in the other disciplines. Like you will see a lot of environmental stuff. There's a very famous bioethicist named Peter Singer who's been producing a lot of work in environmental ethics as well as medical ethics. And then animal ethics tends to fall very heavily within the environmental ethics. It's not always, but questions about like animal identity and animal, like how we treat farmed animals. That's a very big topic within the bioethics world. My education falls mostly into the medical side of it. I studied bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania. And their department was within the Perelman School of Medicine. So I learned mostly everything that would relate to bioethical issues within the medical perspective. We touched on a couple of the other things. And then in undergrad, I took environmental ethics. So I have an understanding of the broader sense of the field, but I'm mostly within the medical side.
And I guess within that one layer deeper, what are like a few of maybe the main principles that you think are important for people to understand if they want to wrestle with some of the things we'll talk about down the road about coaching decisions or morals? Like what are a few things that maybe you could pull out of that literature without, having someone as a higher education like you do?
Well, within bioethics, there's what they call the foundations. So bioethics technically operates at the applied level of ethics. We don't have to go into all of the other levels because it gets a little spooky sometimes when you talk about metaphysical ethics. You're just like, what is personhood? And you're like, okay, I don't need to talk about that right now. I haven't had enough coffee. But you really have two perspectives that dominate ethics today, which is there's two moral theories, which would be deontological, which is derived from Immanuel Kant. This is what I like to call action ethics. And the question is, where does the moral blameworthiness, or where do you judge the moral? Is it the action or is it the outcome? Kant would say it's the action. That's deontological. It's a really long word that I don't like to use, which I just say action. Is it the action? And then you have, of course, the opposite, which is the outcome, which comes from the consequentialist or utilitarian view. And ethicists, they tend to skew more towards the action side, but there's plenty of utilitarians or consequentialists. They're focused on the outcome. And they will write papers to the end of time debating each other about which one it is. From my experience, just with talking with coaches, I think that the vast majority of them are outcome-based moral thinkers, which isn't necessarily an issue, but there are problems with that world of thinking that I think could be addressed that coaches would find very interesting in going back to what we talked about reflecting about the way you're operating. Because outcome can get sticky when you're trying to talk about what kind of outcomes you're looking for. It seems like we can create an outcome that we want, but there's sometimes implications that we wouldn't have anticipated. So it's like we can make really good athletes, but maybe the outcome is also trauma. So that's something that we can go over a little bit later once we're kind of done with the overview.
Yeah.
Bioethics took those two ideas as the foundation, and then they tried to expand that into literature that would really help the medical community. The physicians that were starting to get a lot of the bioethics papers that were coming out, that were writing on topics that they were dealing with, they found it interesting, but they weren't as interested in the philosophical debating that bioethicists would get into. You know, it's like they want something that's going to help them with the ethics, but they don't necessarily want to have all of these sticky arguments about, once again, going back to like the meta ethics, like what is a human being? You know,
Right.
these are important questions that we have to answer, but it's not necessarily important for what we're doing. So you start to see a very large rise in what's called principalism, and you get the 4 principles of medical ethics, which I think most medical professionals can actually recite in the same order. It's interesting because you go all over the world and they know these principles.
Mm-hmm.
And you have respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. Once again, bioethicists love using really long words for really simple things. So you get a term like non-maleficence, and everybody's like, well, what does that mean? It means do no harm,
Yeah.
you know, which everybody knows what do no harm is. That's try to not do something that's going to create harm. Beneficence is just doing good for the sake of good. So it's to do good. And then justice is actually one of the hardest ones to define, because justice can get very, very challenging when you look into it. For today, I think we can kind of focus on respect for autonomy and what that means for coaches. I've always thought that in my own coaching, when I started to understand the principles, it gave you a very simple way to think about the way you're coaching. Because I started to think about my athletes as being people who were autonomous and able to think for themselves. And they had their own goals and their own ideas for the sport. And maybe I wanted them to do a particular thing, but I had to remind myself that, you know, even though this is like a 14-year-old, he might not necessarily want to do what I want him to do. And so I started having a lot more conversations with the kids and trying to be as respectful as I could to what their wishes were, while also maintaining the level of me being the coach and kind of guiding them in the direction that'll be successful in the sport.
Right. I think on that point too, I think autonomy is something, first of all, is like, can you give maybe that's kind of what it is, right? Like someone has the ability and knowledge to make decisions for themselves and they're capable of it, I think is important. But within that, I think that alone is a huge part of what we're going through in sports right now, is a lot of people speaking up and saying like, well, my input was never asked. You know, it didn't seem as though I had a voice in my training. It seems as though things were being done to me. Training was being done to me, not me doing my training. And I think that's where a lot of the negative experiences in some of these athletes have spoken out, is like, I felt like a robot where, you know, they jump, and I'd go, you know, they say, do this, I do this. And there was no conversational partner there. And so as a coach, what do you notice maybe in the world that where autonomy becomes a problem? And what do you suggest that people do to involve their athletes more?
Well, I think first I think we can establish what we mean when we talk about autonomy, because it can be very challenging in a sport like gymnastics, where many of the athletes are underage. Like a vast majority of them are underage. Autonomy has a few different definitions. You can have a legal definition of autonomy, and then you can have a philosophical definition of autonomy. The legal definition is pretty simple. You have autonomy once you become an adult and you have all of your rights. And at that point, those rights exist under the law and they're unquestionable. If you're underage, you don't technically have your own autonomy. You're under the guidance of your parents or your guardian. So gymnastics actually, I think, has a larger challenge than many other sports, because not only do we have a crisis with autonomy, but we also have a crisis where these aren't people that the law recognizes as being fully autonomous. The contrast that I've looked at in my conversations with my professors when I talk about my work is that they bring up the importance of agency and childhood agency. And agency is slightly different than autonomy. Autonomy would be the right to self-governance, where you can make your own decisions. Agency is really the concept of the self and the control of the self. So you can't necessarily take away someone's autonomy if they're an adult, but you can take their agency away. They might not be able to consent, And in that case, we would say they don't really have autonomy, and we would go with a surrogate. You could imagine somebody who is in a coma, but they still have an agency.
Sure.
Somebody loses their agency when you start telling them that they're not in control of their own body. They're not in control of their own thoughts and emotions. And when reading a lot of the articles that I've seen of the athletes who came forward, I think what we see is not only a loss of autonomy, but a loss of agency, where coaches are telling them that the emotions they're feeling, the pain that they're feeling is wrong. They're not only taking it away where you're not allowed to make decisions, they're saying that you as a person are not the authority over yourself. You're not the authority over understanding your emotions or your pain and suffering. And you can see this in very innocent things where coaches will kind of quickly do this, where it's like, I come over and I say, hey, my wrist really hurts. No, it doesn't. You're fine. Well, what did I just do? I'm reinforcing to the kid that you don't know whether or not your wrist hurts or not. And when I'll talk to coaches, they'll be like, well, they could be faking it. It's like, well, they might be, but they might not be faking it. So you can have a conversation with them.
Yeah, I think, and it popped into mind is Jennifer Say's probably most impactful quote from athlete A, I think that I took away and that really moved me significantly was, when she was growing up, she was saying, you feel tired, you feel like your ankle hurts, you feel exhausted, but you're told that you're lazy and you're not hurt and you're not working hard enough. And I think that's exactly what you speak to as a spark and a catalyst for what she says is like, it starts to warp your perception of the world and it warps your trust in yourself. Whereas, like, no, my ankles really hurt. No, you're fine. Keep going. Do two more. And you're like, do my ankles hurt? Like, am I like, should I trust my own sense of interoception and self? Like, it starts to get really wacky where people's distortions then morph into issues around, speaking up and, standing up for yourself when you need to not do something. And I believe that's what we're talking about here. No?
Yeah. Yeah, no, completely. And those are the issues that I'll often see. And when reading about agency and the way that our perception of children with agency, it has grown to the point where we're starting to recognize more and more of it in children, because we're coming to these conclusions where people are coming forward as adults and saying that I was in these bad situations and I didn't feel like I was in control. And you talk about creating an environment of empowerment, but you can't empower somebody if you take away their agency, because they're no longer able to do anything.
Right.
So first you have to be able to recognize where the limits are. What is this person's agency? Where do they begin and where do I stop? And as a coach, it can be challenging because essentially the kids, in a way, they hand over their bodies to you to train and to work, and you become very responsible for what they're doing to become a gymnast, right? So your conditioning routines, your stretching routines, a lot of times you'll work with a nutritionist. So diet becomes a big thing. Coaches have to understand this is not something that you can just expect from athletes. This is a very big deal. The fact that the kids are giving you that level of trust to say, this is my body. I have to exist in it for my entire life. But I trust you enough to make the decisions that are going to keep me safe and keep me healthy. And I'm going to trust you. And if you respect that trust and you do what your athletes need, you're going to have hopefully a successful career and then a life of health. But if you just expect that from your athletes and you just drive them and you don't respect the fact that you can do permanent damage to these kids, you can really affect their agency, but you can also take it away and you can affect the rest of their lives. One of the things that I tell my guys is, 4 years of being a successful gymnast isn't worth 40 years of having to take the elevator. It's like, I really care about your vault, but I care about your knees a little bit more,
Exactly. Yeah. And building off this, something that kind of was in my mind as I was thinking about this podcast is how this concept of responsibility to, make sure they're involved in weighing those pros and cons and what we'd have to do as coaches or role models, parents, everybody involved, medical providers too, is that, I think communication is massively important, of constant feedback loops about, okay, when did your wrist start hurting? What does it feel like? Does it hurt on certain skills? Does it not? And if you do suspect that maybe somebody has a deeper emotional issue, like a fear or some sort of problem with one skill, you have to tease that out. Be like, okay, well, it doesn't seem to hurt on back handsprings on vault, but it hurts on back handsprings on this event, or like it doesn't. So like there's inconsistencies. Can we talk about this? And that's how you
Yeah.
unravel that, that ball of wax sometimes. But I think also what always comes into my mind is these concepts, like you're saying, of do no harm and try to intentionally do good. I think that's where the value of constant education and constant interdisciplinary teams working together is there. Like you as a coach or a medical provider, as a parent, has a responsibility to do no harm by constantly being up to date with the latest evidence or the latest technical training skills. Or, the way that I used to teach Yurchenkos in certain skills 10 years ago is no way like I used to teach this now. Same thing with strength conditioning, same thing with flexibility. So I feel like that's a whirlwind we're living through too, is like there is so much that has changed in 20 to 30 years. And whether it's stubbornness, whether it's culture, whether it's educational gaps and resources, a lot of coaches feel as though they've been left in the dust and don't have the best education. And so it's that concept of do no harm by being most educated, do no
Yeah.
harm by updating your methods and not being so clung to your beliefs and your ideas to think about, well, maybe I need to do strength programs differently. Maybe I need to do spotting differently. Maybe I need to do more team-based assignments or something like that. So that pops into my mind, but is that something you've thought about also in relation to like this ethical thought, or?
Well, that's a mindset that you'll find throughout all of Western culture. It's actually a Platonic idea that the reason people do bad things is because they don't know any better. And that through education, you enlighten the people. And it was one of the ideas that was Platonic's ethic, or Plato's ethics. And it was the philosophy of Socrates, where he would tell you that he's not teaching you a thing, he's getting you to remember a thing. Because they had this conception that when you were born, you had all of your knowledge and then you forgot it. And so everybody would want to be good and would strive for perfection, but you've forgotten how to do it. So through education, you can then develop a better moral framework. I think that it's not a hostile idea. I like the concept. I think it can trick us sometimes, where we think that because we're learning a new idea, that means that we're constantly improving and getting better, which isn't to say anything anti-education. Like go out, read, study as much as you can, but you have to do it in a way that's critical and really examine what's going to happen afterwards. It's not enough to just read the latest studies that are coming out. You have to then examine what that implication is going to look like. And it's okay to keep doing a thing if you think that it works a little bit better. But you should be going out and studying and being mindful of what's going on. And what I find very challenging as a coach is you're kind of asked to do everything. I don't necessarily think it's sometimes the coach's fault. We kind of put ourselves in a position where we're everything. We're just like, I'm going to be your strength coach. I'm going to be a therapist. I'm going to be a gymnastics coach. I'm going to be your nutritionist. It's like, you don't have to put yourself into that situation. But because enough coaches do, you feel pressure to also do it. And that can also be an issue because you get overwhelmed and you can get burnt out very quickly. And it's like, do I really want to go up when I'm done after coaching 7 hours today and start reading some research papers that came out, about whatever body part that I've been, it can be dragging,
I would agree. And I do have a lot of empathy for coaches that I think sometimes are pinned into doing too many things, like you said. And I think the distinction between that lies is that the coach who wears too many hats and is trying to only be a great technical coach, and maybe they dabble in strength conditioning, those are the two things they absolutely love. It's you have to be able to relinquish control of those other things that you're not doing. You have to be willing to work with a nutritionist, or you have to be willing to work with a sports psychologist. You have to be willing to work with a variety of other coaches to learn techniques. So you can't not be willing to put the work in to learn those things, but then also get upset when those things aren't going well. And that's where I think I see some of the most points of catalysm and frustration in our sport, is when like coaches are seen to not only have maybe an egotistical approach that they know all of these things about these fields when they don't, and they're giving out misinformation, but they're also not willing to work with other people who are clearly more experts than they are. And I think that's the area that it gets really murky, is like, okay, you don't want to hear a new idea or work with someone, but you're also upset that your blank isn't working perfectly and the performance isn't going how you want. I think that's where the lines get blurry.
I agree. And I think there's a pragmatic reason where some of that would happen. You have a lot of pressure as a coach to present yourself as the person who knows. as you get a little bit more educated and older, I think you become more comfortable with it. Like I mostly see this with young coaches, like they have to be perfect all the time. Don't criticize me in front of my kids, you know? And it's like, I'm at the point where it's like, I'll do some stuff with the guys and it's just not working. I'm like, look, this isn't working. Let's just try something else.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, like it's fine. And then the kids will like, well, you're the one who gave us that correction. I was like, yeah, and it didn't work. So let's try something else.
yeah.
And it's okay for me. I've always found it very important to show the athletes, like, I'm going to mess up and I'm going to make mistakes. And part of the learning process is that I'm learning too. And we work with each other. But I've known so many coaches where it's like they can't show the athlete that they don't know. And because they feel like that's going to lower their authority, like the kids are going to not respect them. I honestly, in my own experience, I think it's the opposite. The kids tend to respect you less if you do that. They might show you respect to your face, but then as soon as they go away, they're like, that coach, he thinks he knows everything.
Yeah. Well, I think that's this concept of, not to interrupt, sorry, it's this concept of modeling the behavior that you expect to see in the athletes and you want to see at the athletes, right? Gymnastics is a sport of constant mess up and failure and learning. And we want kids to be critical about the things they're doing and why it's not working and how those choices have consequences. If we don't model that as coaches, as parents, as medical providers, how do we expect that? We want to say like, yeah, I don't really know. Let me go talk to someone and let me figure this out. Or like, yeah, this isn't working, as you said, you know, let's try to pivot here. We want to model that humility and that growth mindset and that constant education or that embracing failure and that discomfort, you know, just like they do. That's the best way to teach it.
Yeah, I agree. But that line of thinking can get you to what I've seen a potentially dangerous mindset in coaching. I agree with your point where we want to teach these kids more than just gymnastics, but I'm very hesitant when we start to think of coaches as teaching like the positive values. Something that I've experienced in my time is coaches, when they describe their job, it tends to be that they describe themselves closer to educators and teachers, where they're teaching the value system. And like the gymnastics is the gymnastics, but like what you're really learning is the discipline and the self-motivation and all of these different value systems. And I get very nervous with that because that's a hat that a coach is putting on that I'm not sure they understand the implications of what you're really putting yourself into when you say that's what you're doing. Do we really think that gymnastics coaches are the arbiters of how to live a good life, right? Do they really know the value systems that's going to go off into the world and make these kids better human beings? Because I know a lot of coaches, I could probably count the ones that I would trust to teach my kids a value system on like my one hand. It's not to say the coaches are bad people or that they're teaching bad values. It's just that the idea that you know what's better for somebody else, or you know the lifestyle that somebody else should be living, and then you're going to bestow it upon all of your children is very dangerous, because you're thinking of yourself as being above them in a category. And that idea is described as being paternalistic. That's when I'm acting in a way where I think I know what's best for the people under me. Paternalism can become very dangerous if you are an authority figure and you start acting in a way where you know what's best for everybody that's underneath you. It's something that in medicine had been done for a very long time. It's starting to fall out of favor now. We used to describe physicians as, you know, they would sit down your patients and they would tell them, you know, you got to live this kind of lifestyle. And to an extent, we still do that. You know, we say, you know, you got to eat more healthy, you got to smoke less, or not smoke at all. Paternalism isn't necessarily a bad thing, but imagine if you went in and a physician told you, you need to vote Democrat, right? Like we would look at that and be like, oh, I don't think that's really your say.
Yeah.
So paternalism itself isn't necessarily a problem, but if you're not addressing professional standards that come along with that mindset, like where is the boundary line? Where can me as a coach teach positive values to kids? And where am I overstepping? Where am I overreaching? Because I don't necessarily know what's going to be best for these guys.
Right. And in that context, because this is fascinating to me, because I've never thought about it this way. I like this perspective. But do you think it's then the role of a coach, I guess less a parent, because a parent should probably be truly influencing their moral standards and how they live and how they act. But as a parent or an adult in the sport, as a support staff or as a medical provider, is it our role then to just present the possible options and educate them, try to educate them on the consequences that might happen? Is it our role to guide them in the right direction with some like principles that I think we can all agree upon are good for everyone to learn? Like, treat people the way you want to be treated, like kindergarten stuff,
Yeah.
like, and, be respectful when someone's talking. Like, is it our role to just discuss those surface level behaviors and maybe not try to dig into like, hey, this is how you should live? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Mark? This is interesting to me.
It's a very challenging question. And I think that it's one that there's no answer right now that I could give you that is the correct one. I think we could go back and forth and talk about different ideas. Like the philosopher in me always just wants to present these ideas and just watch the kids go, right? Yeah. Like I just like to give them, sometimes I like to tell them things that are wrong and get them to explain to me why it was wrong, because I find it really funny.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also that's a tool of educating. So like at my gym, the boundaries that I've put up, and the kids know these, I really only have 2 solid rules that they're not allowed to break: no religion, no politics. I think that's really simple.
Sounds like people's family dinner table too.
Oh yeah. I'm like, absolutely none of that here in the gym. It doesn't affect us. We're doing gymnastics. I don't even know who the president is. Who won the election? I don't know. Go do your push-ups, or,
Yeah.
So, and the kids will try to go back and forth. I put it in place because years ago, I used to have a kid who was Hindu and a Christian kid, and the Christian kid and the Hindu kid just argued all practice until eventually it was like, that's it. No one's allowed to talk about this anymore. Yeah. Because you're just creating conflicts amongst the kids. And it's not our place to try to convert anybody to a worldview when they're at gymnastics practice. Like, and also the parents send emails like, why are my kids having religious debates at gymnastics practice? And you're like, that's a very good question. I don't know.
That's amazing. And then in that context, then, if I agree that religion, politics, and many other things, we shouldn't be forcing our ideals on kids. But what do you view is your role as a coach then, in terms of because I mean, I personally very much think my role as a coach is to try to help them develop skills and values and approaches to the world that I think will serve them down the world, like resiliency and, critically thinking through problems and work ethic and being a good teammate. Like, I believe in those principles. It's my motivation to coach. Do you feel as though those are appropriate and relevant? Or are they still kind of in that weird line of like, we're starting to impose values on people?
Well, I would say it's kind of your order that you come about it. Are you a gymnastics coach first, or are you someone who's teaching values and gymnastics? If your job is to teach gymnastics and along the way you teach some values,
yeah,
I don't think that's necessarily a problem. But if you start to approach it from a position of, I'm teaching these kids values, and then I'm going to teach them gymnastics second, I think that's where you could start to stray into dangerous territory. I don't want to say it's right or wrong.
Right.
If you're very, very precise about the way you think about these things, and you're really calculated, and you're studying and you're reading every night, and you've explored all of these different ideas, and you present them as ideas that the kids can either adopt or not adopt, it's probably not a problem. But you also have to remember that level of authority that you have. So you could say something offhandedly, and the kids might take it as a little bit more than you meant it to be.
Sure.
So it's a thing that you can do it. You just have to understand the gravity of what it is. And you have to be respectful of your athletes and not imposing your own thoughts on them in a way that kind of stagnates their growth, developing yourself morally and developing your own philosophies of life is a very personal thing. So for me, I will talk to them about this stuff, but I tend to avoid a lot of the topics. And when I do, it's more that I'll present other people's viewpoints. Like, this is how some people think about it. This is how other people think about it. This is why some people think that's wrong. And then I just kind of let them make their own decision. When it comes to something like a value that's going to benefit them gymnastics wise, I'm a little unorthodox with this, where it's like coaches will talk about discipline and creating discipline. For me, I found that term discipline is often a placeholder for abusive practices. It's like, we say that we're very disciplined here, but what that means is everybody lines up. No one's allowed to talk back. You're just going to bark orders at them, very authoritarian. And then you say that's discipline. To me, that's not discipline. Discipline is being able to motivate yourself and come into the gym and know what you need to do. Go and do the work that you have to do. So I don't do discipline the same way most coaches do. Like, we don't line up. I give them the assignment, and then if they do the assignment's done. If they don't do the assignment, go, did you do the assignment? They're like, nope. And then I say, well, you know what your punishment is? You're going to be the weakest kid on the team. Do you want to be the weakest guy on the team? No. Okay, then you got to do the assignment. And if they don't do the assignment, they understand that that's on them. It's their responsibility. And I have guys that have flourished with that because they do the assignment, they get really strong, and they're progressing. I have guys who will cheat on their conditioning. They won't do their strength work, and they fall behind. And they see everybody else around them getting better at what they're doing. And they look at what they're doing and they realize, well, this isn't working. And maybe they change and then they get a little bit better. Maybe they don't change and then they stay where they are. And yeah. I'm not saying that's the way to do it or that's the correct way to coach. That's my own personal method. But it's another way to think about it where it's challenging as a coach because you take a lot of the responsibility from yourself and you put it onto your athletes, which can create problems for you because maybe your athletes aren't as good. But I think that in the long run, it's better for a lot of the guys because they're learning how to get better on their own. Like when I tell people, I coach in a way where I want to make myself obsolete. Like if I'm not in the gym, they're still doing the things that they need to do. And the guys that have been with me for a few seasons now, like when I tell them to go to pommel horse, I don't have to give them the assignment. They know what they're going to do. They get there, they do their wrist prep, they do their ankle prep or their hip prep. They'll do some of their basics. They have their floor warm up memorized because we normally will do the same basic routine every time. So it's like I say, go to floor, they just go and they do it. And when I get a new kid in the group, he's always like, what's going on? What's happening? And then everybody else is like, oh, you just got to learn this. But it's just a different method that other people will use.
I think a couple of things you said there are fascinating, and I wish I had a billboard I could put them on. The first piece being that I really like that idea of prioritizing it. And now that I reflect a bit, I do think it's that case of I'm teaching gymnastics skills and progressions technique, and it's a vessel for, continuing their gymnastics career. If we get some great moral life lessons along the way, or, I can present them options about like, hey, well, like this is a valuable lesson in choices have consequences. So you come every day, you work hard, you critically think. There are some outcomes that are favorable. You skip practices, you don't do the strength, then maybe the favorable outcomes. And it's my job as a coach to help them sift through the evidence and facts and pieces about what is going on here and help them kind of control their fall if it's a really unfortunate outcome of like a bad performance. But it's not my role to, put the 10 commandments of moral living and being a good human on the wall and be like, these are our things we're going to follow. So that's kind of one thing. But man, there is a huge difference between discipline and obedience. And I think what you highlighted really, really well, whereas the discipline is self-motivated, driven by yourself. You're trying to be, you have goals, here what I have to do to make those goals. And that is, again, under the disguise of obedience, which is line up, do the assignment, don't talk, don't speak up. That is a huge problem. And it links to, I think, a very important point we've been dancing on, which is that concept of authority and power dynamic that has gotten a lot of people in hot water in our sport. I think with that inherent expectation culturally that this is the coach, you listen to what they say, you never speak up, blah, blah, blah. I think that is where we slide down a very slippery slope. Morally and ethically.
I agree completely. I have an unorthodox view of the authority that coaches have over their athletes. Whereas I don't really think that they have a lot of authority. When we talk about authority, there's a couple different frameworks. A lot of times people will talk about authority from like a legal perspective.
Right.
In that case, coaches have almost no authority. We like to talk about being coaches the same way we would talk about being a teacher or an educator. It's a completely different category of authority because a teacher has state-backed authority. Like there is an institution that is the government that is backing a teacher's authority. Most states have mandated education laws. If you don't listen to your teacher, there's legal problems you can get into. Like maybe you get kicked out of your school, but you have to go to another school. And you can't just not go to school. Whereas coaching, really, if the kid decides I'm done with this, they can quit at any moment. You know, there's never a moment where the kid has to do what I tell them to do. If they say, I don't want to do my strength, I'm like, well, you have to do your strength work today. And they're like, I quit. That's the end of it. It's over. Like, okay, have a good life. I'll see you. I'll see you around.
Yeah.
But coaches don't really want kids to know that they can do that. You know, like we have an interest in maintaining this illusion of authority. Like, you have to listen to me. I am the coach. And a lot of coaches coach from the perspective of maintaining this illusion, right? Like, and we'll talk about it as coaches. Once the kids stop respecting that level of authority, it's like, all right, well, you can't be their coach anymore. Like, if they're not going to listen to you, you can't coach them. So everybody has their way of maintaining the authority over their kids. So you have to do it through respect. Like, you gain the athlete's respect. He thinks that I know what I'm talking about, so now he's going to listen to me. Or, unfortunately, a lot of coaches will motivate through fear. They'll try to dominate the athlete. They'll try to make it so that they can't even contemplate not listening to the coach because they're terrified of the consequences. There are no real consequences that coach can do to you. And eventually the kids will figure this out. And once that happens, the fear method always fails. But a lot of coaches rely on that level of fear. And I remember when I was a young coach and I was learning things, I was at a camp and I was talking to a coach who much older than I was and very experienced. And he was explaining to me his whole coaching philosophy. And it was, the kids have to be more afraid of you than they are of the skills, you know? And I remember back then thinking that was very wrong, but I was young and I didn't really know how to articulate it. So I was just like, yeah, okay, whatever, man. And I've never really forgotten that conversation because he taught me a very important lesson, which is how to not be a coach. I've tried to approach the level of authority with my athletes by doing something that most coaches I don't think would do, which is just getting rid of the illusion. Just being like, you don't have to do this. This is your choice. You're deciding. If they tell me they don't want to do their strength, I'm like, okay, don't do your strength. And then the kids are like, well, what do you mean? But it's the same punishment. You're going to be the weakest kid on the team. Do you want to be a good athlete? Do you want to be a level 10? Do you want to go to the top? Then this is the work that we provide, right? This is what I'm going to give you. If you do it, you'll be successful. If you don't do it, you're not going to go where you want to go. But it's always a conversation. And once the kids understand that they're allowed to say no to these things, or they're allowed to have a conversation with you, you know, I think you actually find a lot of the things that they need to understand, or that they need to actually get better. And it can be little things where it's like, hey guys, we're going to do core today. And they're like, we did core 2 days ago. Can we do legs today? Yeah, okay, you're right. Let's do legs today. And it becomes a conversation where they don't have to just get yelled at all the time. And the athletes get to take control of their own gymnastics. They start to understand that, like, when this isn't working, it's a little bit on me. And they're very able to come up and tell me things that they think that I'm doing wrong. And then I can learn from my guys. So it becomes a two-way street. The way that I've been thinking about authority and coaching recently is that as coaches, we really have about as much authority as somebody who works at Disney World, right? It's like, we can kick them out of the park, but imagine how weird it would be to see somebody at Disney World, like, you have to do 50 push-ups or you can't go on that ride, right? I mean, that's really where we are. We're not teachers. If the kids don't want to do it, the only thing we can do is kick them out of the gym.
Which never seems to work in the long run anyways.
No, it doesn't work. So it's like, why even try to maintain the illusion? Why try to fight it?
Yeah.
Like, with little kids, it's different. Like, I mostly work with teenagers, like 14, 15-year-old boys. If you have a little kid, you know, there are certain things that, like, you just have to do, right? Like, you got to teach them, you can't walk in front of the vault runway.
Right.
You know, you can't run under the high bar when somebody's doing a giant. So when you're working with little kids, like, you do have to think about the perspective. And I'm not saying that we're like, well, do you want to walk in front of the vault runway? How do you feel about it? You know, we're not going to have that conversation. Obviously, you're going to say, like, don't do that, you'll die.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, it's still thinking about it. Even with the little guys, it's like, you let them have a conversation at the level they're at. and you include them in the conversation at the level that they're at, or maybe just slightly above where they're at, and then they can kind of learn to come to that level. But you always have to be thinking about where you are with the kids.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think that the concept of this was a really tough pill for me to swallow when I kind of dissolved my own illusion of authority, was I can't make anyone do anything. You know what I mean? But I do hold the right to, if they're not safe, withhold them from competition, or if they're
yeah,
not doing skills safely, pull them back. And I think that was something I learned along the way. But something I'm a firm believer in is like, we never barter with strength, positive or negative. And I
yeah,
like, never going to punish somebody with strength, but I'm also not going to reward somebody with getting out of strength, right? That's
yeah,
the opposite side of the coin. I think a lot of people miss is like, a lot of gyms I see is like, if we all make our bar routines, can we not do cardio tonight? If we all do this, can we skip our rope climbs tonight? And I always tell the kids like, no, we're not going on either side of the coin. I'm never going to make you do strength because you did something wrong. And I'm never going to reward you of getting out of strength because you did something great. Strength is a necessary part of what we do. And it's a part of how we reach our goals. It is what it is. It's not always fun, but it is what it is. That's a necessary requirement. I think that
yeah,
changes the context around how people view strength, but I think that comes into a lot of other things about like, stand on the beam and do it until you get it right. Like, you have 5 more and don't stop until you keep going. Like, that kind of idea around, if it's not happening and they're not going to do it, they're not going to do it.
yeah,
It is what it is.
yeah,
And I think it's a perfect way to blend this conversation to something we talked about on the phone that is very important to come up, is that idea of consent and that idea of, athlete input. So I'd love for you to share some ideas academically about, what is consent? Because that is a huge story or a piece of people's story that I have read on the emotional abuse or the psychological abuse in gymnastics, is like, I never really had a choice. It felt as though, and I never was asked, do I want to do this? It was like, this is what you do it. And if you don't do it, you're going to miss your shot. You're going to not get
yeah,
your scholarship. I'm not going to coach you. I'm going to give you psychological warfare and just ignore you in practice. And so let's maybe expand into that a little bit.
yeah. Well, consent is one of those topics now where it's a lot of literature is being published on consent and understanding consent, because it is a challenging topic, because it really embodies everything in our conversation we've had so far. Paternalism, agency, autonomy, all of it comes into play with consent, and it becomes so challenging. It's very easy to say something like, you have to consent, right? Well, what is that? Oh, you have to say it's okay, right? That sounds simple until you start to look into the details, where it's like, well, what if somebody forces you to do it, but you still said yes? Coercion. Well, you can't coerce people to do what you want them to do. So if you're using fear as a motivator and saying, you have to do that back handspring, otherwise you're not going to be able to be whatever level you want to be next year. And they're like, well, now I got to do the back handspring. And you're like, well, the kid decided to do it. Well, did the kid decide to do it, or did you force the kid to do it with a threat? If you're threatening them, that's coercion. On the other side of it, coercion can be you offer them something they really want, something that's like a deal too good. Kind of what you were talking about, was like, if we all do this today, then nobody has to do any strength. Okay, so did the kid really want to do it, or did you just give them a deal that they thought was so good? So in medical ethics, for instance, you can't offer a tremendous amount of money to participate in a research study, because it's coercion. If I offer you $10,000 to take a drug that may have bad side effects, we don't know, we're testing it. One, it's going to target poor people more than it's going to target other people, because they're going to be the ones really desperate. And so you inadvertently just start experimenting on lower income people. But also, it's like, people aren't necessarily able to weigh those options long term. So it's creating harm. And the idea for consent is to try to allow somebody to be able to weigh the options and make their own best decision. Consent depends on the idea that we are able to understand what's best for us. Like, we're the best people around who can figure out what's good for me. You can't do that if the consent that's offered is not explained thoroughly. So you'll have consent, and then you'll have what's called informed consent in the medical world, where it's not enough to just come in and say, hey, do you consent to this cancer research? They have to go through step by step, and they have to tell you the risks. They have to explain what could actually happen, so you know what you're consenting to. Once again, I have kind of a radical idea for this in gymnastics, which is that I think that we kind of need a very universal form of consent, because once again, we don't have actual authority over the kids. They have to say they want to do it. They have to say that they agree to it. Otherwise, they can just quit at any moment. And if we're operating in a way where we're trying to force the kids to listen to us, well, you're coercing your children. You're not getting consent from them. If you're not explaining to the kids what they're trying to do, you're not getting informed consent. So I try to go into detail with my guys and explain what we're doing things for. Like, we're doing these push-ups to become stronger. And I do this with everybody. I even do this with the really little guys. I'll be teaching 6-year-olds and I'll ask them, like, why are we doing push-ups at the end of practice? Are we in trouble? And they'll be like, yeah. I'm like, no, we're not in trouble. We're doing push-ups to become stronger. That's why we do push-ups. We do push-ups to become stronger. There's no other reason why you would do a push-up. And I, as your coach, I like strong boys. So I give them push-ups at the end. And so then I get this little group of boys at the end of practice. I'll ask them the same question. They start answering the question the way I told them. It's like, why are we doing conditioning? They're like, to get stronger. So it's reinforcing the outcome that the kids are out for. It's providing them with the ideas, and it's being respectful of even some of your youngest athletes and getting them on board with the ideas. And consent, once again, from a legal perspective, it's not necessary to get the consent of minors. It's necessary to get consent of their parents. But as coaches, I'm a firm believer that we should be so far outside of the realm of what is legal or isn't legal. Like that shouldn't come up. We should be well within what the law says, and then we should go above it. It doesn't matter what the laws on consent are for coaching. We should have higher standards than the legal minimum. Like, I see that as a bare minimum, and then I should be higher than that. Which isn't to say that this is easy. This makes coaching very challenging when you have to have these conversations, because kids aren't necessarily going to know what's best for them. They're not going to be able to understand long-term gymnastics decisions. For them, it's like, oh yeah, I don't have to do my push-ups. That's awesome. I'm not going to do that. I don't care if I'm going to be weak. So it does make it harder for you. But I think that, well, it creates some short-term challenges that you have to overcome with working with the athletes. It's better long-term because you get kids who they take control of their own gymnastics, and they start to see this as something that they have to take over and they have to control. And it's something that they have to want to do. And it's okay if you don't want to do it. You should only be here doing this if you want to do it. And if you want to do it, you have to consent to it. And that's part of the process. That's part of the learning process, is you saying, this is what I want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I think a lot about, and I think this conversation of consent dials around, is the new skills and fear. And, I think sometimes we just tell athletes to do things, because internally in our heart, we know they're capable, it's going to help them reach their potential. They have the ability to do it, and they have nerves, but there's a very blurry line there where you have to explain very in depth about, like, hey, let's try a giant, or like, hey, let's try a double back. And they're like, oh my God, no, I can't do that. And you have to explain to them, like, well, here, listen, we've done these drills, we've done these timers, we've seen things progress. Here's why I think you can do it. I'm telling you, I think you are able to do this. I'm going to spot you. There's a pit here. Like, you explain the details and you say, do you want to do this? And I think that's lost on a lot of coaches, that they're just saying, they're that little bit of the end of, like, here's the thing that we're going for. Here's why it matches the goals you have said that you want to get to. Do you feel like you want to do this? And some kids will say no. They'll be like, I can't, I'm not ready. That is very different interaction and complexity around consent than do a giant, or like, hey, we're doing double back, we're pulling the mats out this time. I'm not spotting you this time. And they're like, oh my God, what? And like, no, you're fine. Just go. Like, the difference in those two approaches to getting a new skill, I think, gets people in a lot of tough situations, because as kids, they obviously want to do the skill. They obviously want to feel good about doing the skill and making progress. And there's a massive fear of disappointment. A lot of kids are fearful of letting their coach down, even though I actually don't believe that's a healthy way to live. But a lot of kids inherently don't want to let their themselves down or their coaches down, so they'll do it. And it goes back to the idea of coercion, whereas they're doing it because they don't want to be in the doghouse with coaches. They don't want to let someone down and get a negative response. So I don't know. I just think that fear and skills and stuff is another really important time to have really informed consent decisions.
I agree completely. And the other point that I will put out there is, I don't want to present this as some kind of orthodoxy to be like a doctrine that we have to adopt universally. Like there's plenty of moments where I'll get frustrated. I'm just like, look, dude, you just got to do your giants. Like get on the bar, like
Yeah.
take a turn, you know?
Yeah.
And it's not that that's necessarily a bad thing. Like sometimes the kids do need a push. And as a coach, you do have to give them a push. Like you're fine, get up. Like you do this skill all the time.
Yeah.
It's about the umbrella relationship, right? One particular interaction does not define your coach-athlete relationship. There's a lot of interactions that define it. Maybe this kid today needs the bad coach to just go like, get up, go. We're not having a conversation about it. You got to do your blind change today.
Yeah.
But what's the overall relationship that you have with that athlete? Are you respectful of the athlete? Do you understand the goals of the athlete, where they want to go? And you understand that this is something that they want to do. They might not want to do it in this moment, but it is something that they want to do. And then when you can talk to them about it afterwards, it's not an easy thing to do. And it's a contradiction right in and of itself, where it's like you have to get consent, but sometimes, you know, maybe you got to push the kid. And that's what I think it makes it very challenging in the gymnastics world. The sport's not really designed to have this kind of interaction with your kids. The sport is designed to constantly progress, constantly get better. You always have to be going. So as a coach, I always have to be pushing my kids. Like, do you want to be a level 10? Okay, well, we got to get this skill, this skill, this skill, this skill. And it's like, as soon as you're getting the skills, then they just want to take a breather. You're like, we're way behind, man. Like the season's coming up and you're still missing 5 of your elements. Like, I don't know if you're going to be able to do level 10. And it's not that I don't want you to do level 10. It's like, we're just behind and we just got to go. So as a coach, you have tremendous pressure. I want to be respectful of my athletes and I want to treat them with as much respect as I can. But then as the coach, I also have a responsibility to get them to where they want to be as athletes and to get them to achieve those goals. And it's not an easy thing to do.
It raises this question that we come back to too. I think we talked about it with paternalism, about like, I hear a lot from people who've had negative experiences about like the defense that they were acting a certain way, or yelling, or, you know, because overtraining, relentless conditioning that had no scientific basis, was like, well, this is what's best for them in the long run. Like this is what it takes to reach your goals. And, you know, I have all the knowledge and the experience and the ideas that I know what's best for you as a coach who's been there before, and you're just an athlete who's learning. You don't know what this really takes. And they use that as a facade or a guide sometime to make decisions that are maybe immoral. And I think this is where it's down to, one, surrounding yourself with people who don't give you an echo chamber of only your ideas, but also two is, you know, just because it was successful with one athlete or a group of athletes, like, yes, there's a variety of things that we need to do. You need to condition, you need to do flexibility, you need to do your drills, you need to do all this stuff. But I think that facade of like, I know what's best for you because I've been there, is really, really dangerous.
Yeah. Well, and also this brings us back to a point that I said at the beginning, we can get into a really deep, sticky one. So I think it's towards the end. So let's get into the deep, sticky one, where it's that you have values, right? And when I talk about what's best for you, I'm talking about a value-laden system, right? Like, I'm telling you a set of values that I hold dearly, and these are what's best for you, and how this will sometimes retroactively change your sport and change your morals. What I see in gymnastics right now is that we have adopted a set of values, and these values create a lot of the problems that we are facing. It's a systemic problem with gymnastics and the way we view it. It's not even gymnastics. Honestly, it's just youth sports in general, and it's just sports in general. The way that I distinguish the two is I say, is sports a science or is sports a humanity? Sports as a science makes it objective and goal-oriented. There's an idea of progress, and the sport gets better, and we're moving towards some goal. And you'll hear people talk about this in conversation where they'll say, the sport's progressed, it's gotten better. There was a post, I think, from the Olympics on Instagram I saw the other day, where it had a ring routine from like 1950 and then a ring routine from 2016. They're like, look at the progress of the sport. Well, when you use a term like progress, there's a value underlining in there. They're saying that there was something that we used to be, but now we're better than. We've progressed. Well, what exactly is that value that we're saying we've progressed to? In gymnastics, it's difficulty. As the sport gets harder, we say that the sport has progressed. So we're forced into this system that is constantly generating harder and harder gymnastics and higher levels of difficulty, and the kids are constantly having to push more and more to keep up with it. From a scientific mindset. But I would really like to pose the question to a lot of coaches, which is, what if this isn't a science? What if it's a humanity? And what I mean by that is there's no goal. We're not trying to do a thing. We're just doing the thing because it's benefiting ourselves, right? We don't say that poetry has progressed. It's changed. Some people will say it's progressed, but we normally ask them to leave the room. It's changed. It's not the same that it used to be. But if you read Hemingway or you read one of my favorite Latins like Martin, right? It's very different poetry. But I wouldn't say that one of them is necessarily better than the other. It's just changed. It's different. Yeah. The idea of progress really drives a lot of our coaching. It drives a lot of the value system that we have in the sport because we're constantly trying to get better, but better equals harder. Not every sport does this. And I think that gymnastics is a little unique in a way, and it's a little weird when you think about it. Like, we didn't make the basketball hoop higher because Jordan was so good.
Yeah.
We didn't make the swimming pool longer because Michael Phelps could swim so fast. Yet in gymnastics, we're like, well, now we have to have a D dismount. Right. C's aren't good enough anymore. Actually, we're going to devalue the Yamawaki. We're going to take the straddle plant out of the code. We don't need that anymore. It's too easy for us. And I use an analogy that I give to people. Imagine track and field where you have a race. And every time somebody breaks the world record, you have a qualifying score. And that qualifying score, just to participate in the race, goes up. How many times can somebody break the world record until almost no one is able to participate because of the qualifying score? Or think of it from this perspective. Let's say at the beginning, it takes about 10 hours for the average person to hit that, 10 hours of training a week for the average person to hit that qualifying score. But then it goes up. Now the average person has to train 15 hours. Then it goes up again. Now the average person has to train 20 hours, 30 hours, 40 hours. How high does that qualifying score have to be until you're just in an abusive system? We're asking people to train too much, putting them in the gym for too long. 30 hours a week is just too much training time. It doesn't matter what you're doing. Just asking people to do that is abusive. And a point that I've been making to a lot of coaches that I know, why is it that we accept at the NCAA level a 20-hour cap for training time for all sports, but we don't have that idea at all at the JO level? And to even ask that question is just, it's mind-blowing. Coaches are like, what are you saying? We're going to lose all this progress. The kids won't be as good. It's like, yeah, the kids won't be as good. But the question is your value system laid where good gymnastics overrides a healthy environment and a less abusive coaching technique? Or if the sport suffers its difficulty and it gets easier long-term and we're not able to do the same things, but we have a less abusive sport where we're not abusing the kids, is that worth it? Because I really think that if we're in a position where we make the sport less challenging for the athletes and that gives them a healthier environment, any coach who says that that's a bad idea, I don't think should really be in the sport. Like, we need to be able to give up some of the things that we've been doing if it means that the kids are going to be safer. And if you're going to put the brakes and say, no, we can't do that because we'll lose our progress, I'm going to ask you first, what progress? Because I don't think difficulty necessarily equals progress. I think that that's one area where the sport progresses, but I think that it's led to a lot of regression in the sport, especially on the men's side. Like, it's gotten so hard, nobody can do it anymore. There's like 1,800 or 18,000 male gymnasts in the United States. And they say the sport's gotten better. How? No one can do it anymore. You'll have like 3 or 4 kids in a state who are able to compete at the top level. To me, that doesn't scream progress. That screams a sport that they've got their priorities all wrong. It's not about the difficulty of what they can do. It's about giving the kids an environment where they become better. It's about giving the kids an environment where they're healthy and they learn not necessarily the values that we talked about, but giving them a way where they can express themselves through physical education and eventually grow as people. But we've got this concept that it has to be harder every year, and I don't understand that.
Yeah, it is a fascinating conversation with many layers. And I think the devil's advocate in me says, you know, a lot of people I hear from is that, well, they feel as though they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and the treadmill of the sport at an international level is so demanding uphill. Whereas like, okay, so say we put training hour limits on young kids and we do whatever, the NCAA competitiveness to get a scholarship, people are going to bend the rules. People are going to find a way around it. They're going to train more hours, and they're going to get the scholarship that little girl dreams of, or that little boy dreams of. And then even higher, you know, there are some countries out there that don't exactly have the same moral standards around what you do with young training. And then we fall behind. We're not competitive on the Olympic stage, the international stage. So what are your thoughts on that? Is that like just we got to swallow our pride and put our priority of kids above medals, which check for me. But I think a lot of people would say like, yeah, but if we're not competitive on the elite stage, you know, it's going to fall apart. We're going to lose a lot of interest.
Well, I have two thoughts, which is one, I don't think the response that coaches always have is that if we change the system, that it's going to get worse. I don't necessarily believe that. It's not necessarily going to get, our gymnastics isn't necessarily going to get worse. I'll use men's gymnastics as an example because that's the discipline I'm in. And this is a very, I would say, popular viewpoint in the gymnastics world. Less isn't necessarily better, right? You're always going to have kids out there that are just super talented athletes that are going to be able to push the boundaries. More kids in the sport just means that you're getting more kids interested in it. If you lower the level of difficulty at the lowest level so you can bring in more people into the sport, you're going to attract more talented kids. If we have 100,000 guy gymnasts in the country, I guarantee we're going to have better gymnastics because we're just going to have such a sheer volume of kids, like right? Women. But if you just try to tinker away so that only the best can get through the sport and like there's no room for anybody else, like because currently men's gymnastics has no room for mediocrity. Like if you're just okay, what are you doing? Like go play a different sport. You'll get a scholarship with that. You have to be the best of the best to go anywhere. But if you open the doors and you allow more kids to come in, your sheer volume of athletes, you're going to have better guys. I guarantee it. If you make it easier for the lower levels, you're going to have kids that are way better at the top. My second point is the fear of falling behind the international stage kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, which is that outcome thought process, right? The action versus the outcome. If the act of having a slightly more toxic sport allows us to be dominant on the world stage, is that something that we would want to put in place? The outcome of us being the top of the international stage, does that outweigh abusive practices? You know, like everybody is very quick to jump on USAG and criticize what they're doing, but then they're also very quick to praise when we win everything. Well, you're praising the process, or you're praising the outcome, but not talking about the process. Do our values say that we want to keep the kids safe? Or do our values say that we want to win medals? We say we want to keep the kids safe, but then as soon as a suggestion comes up where this will increase the kids' safety, but it might decrease our ability to win, everybody's very quick to be like, I don't know about that one. You know, like that's a lot to ask for me. I mean, I'm not about medals. But like, do we really have to make that sacrifice? I would say we should. Because I think it's a false dichotomy to say that keeping the kids in a safer environment will mean that they're not going to be as effective at the Olympics. I think that it's the opposite. I think that they'll be in a much better place.
I would agree.
But it's hard.
It is. It's very challenging. But I mean, these conversations that are icky and uncomfortable and sticky, like you said, are what we need to have. And I think you really outlined something I wanted to end the podcast on. I'm glad we got to it is how I feel a lot of these points of change and points of this really comes down to personal values
Yeah.
and developing a personal moral fabric that you can stand on when things, get tough. And also just having, what I sometimes refer to as the ethical engineering, to have a process in your mind about when stuff hits the fan. You have a systematic, critical thinking way to think about, okay, what are my values? What are my morals? What are my ethics? Where does this fall in line with that? And how do I make a decision based off that? So can you maybe share your ideas about how maybe values and personal values and personal morals kind of set this foundation?
Yeah. Um, this might be more philosophical than you want, but I think that it's a good idea.
Fire away.
Uh, in the in the United States, we very heavily fall under a philosophical tradition called analytic philosophy. We very much like scientific oriented thought process, right? Very logical, right? Step one, step two, step three, outcome. Um, that's not necessarily the only way that you can think about the world. Our ethics tends to be very analytic in tradition. It's very argumentation driven. It's very, here's the principles that we have laid out in front of us. Um, and it's very good in an academic sense. But in the actual person to person interaction, like it's easy to say that I subscribe to a deontological worldview. So I believe that the action is where the moral value is. And I always police the action because that's where it is. It's very abstract. It's very taken out of the moment. And there were philosophers that I really enjoy, one of them being a man named Arthur Schopenhauer. He didn't see ethics as being a objective system. He saw ethics as being a emotional system. And it's something where you get a feeling and you're not driving your ethics or your emotions through rational reasons. You're not thinking your way to having the feeling. You're having a subjective experience. When I do something wrong, it makes me feel bad. When I do something good, it makes me feel good. This was later expanded on with another philosopher named David Hume. And he wrote a kind of similar idea, which was that our reason is a slave to our passions. We like to think that we are in control and that we're creating these rational systems and we're building these moral systems and these moral ethics. But really what's happening is we're having emotional responses and then we're justifying them through rational means. For me, it's not really something you can teach. It's something that you have to experience. And if you want to live an ethical, moral life outside of even coaching, you have to start to think about it from a perspective of emotion, right? Like I can rationalize that I'm always doing the right thing and I'm trying to line up with this moral system that I have. But that takes you out of the actual interactions you're having with people, right? And you really got to think about like the way you're talking to somebody and the way that the person's interacting, the actions that you're doing to those people. What is it doing to them emotionally? What is it doing to me emotionally? Have I hardened myself against it? Like, do I have compassion for the people around me? If I'm pushing my athletes to the point where I can see them burning out and I can see them in pain, and it's pain that I know that we don't necessarily need to do that, do I have compassion for those kids? Or am I just so hell-bent on getting that outcome that I want, those medals that I want, or being on the international stage, that I'm willing to sacrifice that emotion? To me, I think that you're not going to be able to fix the problems that we deal by creating a moral code or an ethics code. We have to start thinking about this as an emotional thing. And we have to start talking about it as being compassionate and about being understanding about the people that we're working with. Because I think that that's going to humanize this. One of the things that I always notice with gymnastics is we tend to take away agency in many ways. But one way that I saw coaches do is they just refer to kids as the athlete. You'll see the athlete's angle in their handstand is below such and such. So they get this deduction, right? The athlete hadn't developed core strength, so they weren't able to hold that skill. No, that was Tim. I love Tim. He's a great kid. He's bubbly. He comes in. He's all happy. He's like, yeah, he doesn't do his sit-ups, but like that's Tim. It's important to remember these are children. These are kids. We talk about it like it's a science, like we're progressing, we're growing, and we're on the international stage. It's very easy to lose focus on what we're actually talking about, which is a kid and their future and their life and their agency and who they are and what they are. And when we talk about weighing the option of maybe being slightly more abusive to get on the world stage, or giving up the world stage for Tim, you know, and are the kids worth doing that for? And I think when you think about it from the perspective of these are actual living human beings that I have compassion for and I want to see grow, it really changes the way you think about the outcome.
I would agree. And I was intrigued by that. I learned so much from the last 5 minutes of hearing that. I think that concept you brought up, just to kind of wrap things up here, that danger in dehumanizing someone is something we know is very, very problematic in many other areas of the world, especially the scientific world, but especially that idea of, the loss of autonomy, the loss of agency. You dehumanize them by saying the athletes, or you put them into that robotic fashion where there's no communication, there's no thought process to their emotions, their injuries. I think we lose ourselves morally when that happens. When you actually become you're pulling puppet strings to make something come of an outcome, right? And I think the best way that I can summarize this is, I agree with you that it is worth it to pull back slightly to make health a priority. And two, I do not believe that path will lead to less competitive success. I think that the kids that are super talented and have the drive and have the motivation and get put in the right environment are going to succeed still. I think they're going to really be successful, and they're going to enjoy the process much, much thoroughly as they go about it. And I think we have never, in my opinion, we have never entertained the alternative path of what we saw the last 30 years, which was very fear-driven, very hardcore, very cutthroat. We have never given the athletes a chance to operate in interdisciplinary care and a longer-term athletic development model and make the path longer through college and change some of the rules or change some of the ideas. We have never entertained that model of a science-based, collaborative method with health and priority. And I hope we're seeing the beginning of that path now. But I think we're going to look back in 15, 20 years when we really do get some change to happen and be like, there was a better way. There was a way to do it, but we never actually gave them a chance. And look how far we've come.
Yeah. And the sport will fundamentally change when that happens. I wouldn't say it will progress in the difficulty, but I hope that it will progress morally and the way that we view the athletes.
I couldn't agree more, man. I could literally sit with you for 2 more hours and talk about this stuff. This was fascinating. I really appreciate your input, but maybe we'll start the beehive of thought. And we'll have a part 2 once we get some feedback from it.
Yeah. The note that I'd like to leave us on is that if at any point you found these ideas uncomfortable and challenging to wrap your head around, that's part of ethics. That's the response that we want. You don't want to walk away from a conversation about morals and morality and be like, oh yeah, I do all the right things. It should feel uncomfortable, and it should drag out very personal ideas that you hold very close to yourself, and you should really have to examine it. And it's not an easy thing to do. I have a lot of respect for people who are able to do it. It's something that I've struggled with my entire life. It's challenging, but it's so worth it in the long run, because this is how we grow. And I want to thank you so much for bringing me onto the podcast. I had a lot of fun chatting with you. I'd love to do it again sometime.
Absolutely, man. Yeah. Even, I mean, avid podcast listeners will know there's 2 or 3 points in there that we danced upon that, I have some strong thoughts about that. I definitely within the hour was like, I got to take a step back and think about that. So I'm looking forward to a journaling session where I go over some of these ideas and edit the podcast, but definitely do another one down the road.
Okay. I'd definitely be interested.
Awesome. All right, Tom, thank you so much. And we'll catch you soon. All right.
All right.